5 kilometers northwest of Dolly's Cay in the Bahamas lies a deep, dark blue void in the coral reef known as the Four Sharks Blue Hole. In 1997, a group of the world's most skilled divers ventured into a hidden cave restriction that led to an uncharted cavern within this blue hole. But what began as a recreational exploration quickly descended into a terrifying ordeal as mysterious circumstances forced one diver into making a desperate decision. What happened in that underwater cavern was nothing short of terrifying. These are the final moments of the Robert Parker diving tragedy. On the evening of August 17, 1997, around 8 p.m., Rob Parker and Dan Malone, better known as Duffer, sat on the edge of a boat. They were roughly 3 miles off the coast of Dolly's Cay in the Bahamas. The two made a few final adjustments to their gear, exchanged a palpable glance, nodded, and almost simultaneously tipped backward into the ocean. In just a few moments, Rob, Duffer, and 2 support divers would begin their descent into the Four Sharks Blue Hole, embarking on another dive in their long distinguished careers. Both were seasoned professionals, with Rob in particular standing out as an expert. At just 30 years old, Rob was already considered one of the world's premier divers and was often hailed as the top diver in the UK. His reputation was further cemented when he set a record by diving 206 feet in England's Wookey Hole, a depth that remained virtually untouched for 20 years. But although this dive was meant to be recreational, the real reason they were in the Bahamas was work-related. The divers were part of a team featured in a documentary called Fascination Blue Hole for the German TV network NDR. Rob joined the team unexpectedly after tragedy struck one of the most respected divers in the community. Flashback to just 4 months earlier, their close friend and one of the most renowned figures in technical and cave diving at the time tragically lost his life while diving in a blue hole in the Red Sea. Rob Palmer had been attending a technical diving conference in Egypt with some diving friends. When the conference was over, the attendees planned a fun expedition dive that was supposed to be a straightforward descent along an underwater wall, exploring the marine life that had colonized its rocks. However, when Palmer entered the water, something went terribly wrong. It was as mysterious as it was heartbreaking. Instead of joining the others at the wall, he began sinking rapidly. The other divers quickly followed, trying to catch up, but Palmer descended way too fast. Divers pursued him to a depth of 325 feet before they were forced to stop and return to the surface. In fact, pushing any further would have been certain death given the limitations of their equipment at such extreme depths. Sadly, Palmer's descent was unstoppable and he was never seen again. His body sank to a depth that made recovery impossible. And to this day, the exact cause of Palmer's rapid descent remains a mystery. At the time of his death, Palmer was one of several divers being filmed for the German TV documentary. Despite the tragedy, the decision was made to continue the project as a tribute to Palmer's legacy. That said, Rob Parker was invited to fill Palmer's place, and he accepted the offer without hesitation. Rob and Duffer had been in the Bahamas for 2 weeks now, adhering to a rigorous filming schedule that kept them in crystal clear waters every day. But these dives were routine, and routine wasn't Rob's style. He thrived on challenges and pushing boundaries, and the lack of excitement was starting to wear on him. Duffer, having known Rob for years, recognized the signs. Rob needed something thrilling to get back to his usual self, and a more daring dive was just the ticket. But this would be no ordinary dive. It had to be a secret. Their planned dive into the Four Sharks Blue Hole was risky, even for professionals like them, and they knew the film crew and their insurers would never approve. The plan was simple: get in, complete the dive, and return before anyone noticed they were gone. The reason Four Sharks Blue Hole was so dangerous wasn't just its depth. Blue holes themselves are treacherous by nature. These beautiful natural wonders are ancient underwater sinkholes formed during the ice ages. They're scattered across the world's oceans, with the Bahamas being a hotspot. Interestingly, it was Rob Palmer who first discovered Four Sharks, which is why it became the focus of the documentary. When it comes to the dangers of blue holes, opinions vary widely among experienced divers. This is because no single factor makes them dangerous. It's the combination of various unpredictable elements that makes diving into them so perilous. To start, it's clear that the first undeniable fact about blue holes is their immense depth. An uncontrollable descent, like what happened in Palmer's case, can quickly spiral into an unrecoverable situation. Plus, many blue holes plunge to depths where the pressure becomes unbearable for humans. Some are essentially vertical caves with a straight shaft from top to bottom, resulting in poor water circulation. Others feature offshoots or tunnels that connect to nearby cave systems or the open ocean. In these, changing tides can generate powerful water currents that either rush in or out, depending on the direction. Divers must carefully time their dives with the slack tides to avoid these dangerous currents, which is why Rob and Duffer began their dive at 8 p.m. On the night of the dive, Rob, Duffer, and their 2 support divers floated on the surface above Foreshark's blue hole, performing a final check of their equipment. Rob might have had a taste for daring dives, but he never compromised on safety. Once everything was in order, Rob raised his fist above the water, then pointed downward. The other divers gave the OK signal, and together they began their descent into the blue hole. The dive plan was straightforward. All 4 divers would head to the entrance of the large cavern, about 20 feet below the surface. There, they would stash spare tanks for use during the decompression stops on their ascent. After a quick confirmation with the OK signal, Rob and Duffer proceeded into the cavern, leaving the support divers behind. As is common in many well-known underwater caverns, a fixed guide rope was in place at the cavern's entrance. This rope was essential for helping divers navigate in and, more crucially, out of the cave. Rob and Duffer followed the rope approximately 300 feet to the back wall where the cave ended and the restriction, or the narrow passage, began. This is where the guide rope ended, since no one had ventured beyond this point. From here, they had to set up and rely on their own rope. Duffer pulled out a reel of rope from his belt and secured the loose end to the entrance. Before entering the restriction, they stashed another 2 tanks for decompression, and then Rob, leading the way, squeezed through the 2-foot-wide opening. In preparation for these tight spaces, they were using open-circuit side-mounted gear, which allowed them to position their 3 tanks along their sides rather than on their backs, making their profiles narrower. Each diver carried 2 tanks of Trimex, a blend of nitrogen, helium, and oxygen, under one arm, and a tank of compressed air under the other. These gases would be crucial during their dive, with the type of gas they breathed depending on the depth they reached. Their plan was to use compressed air until they reached about 220 feet, then switch to Trimex for the remainder of the descent to 250 feet. This switch was intended to reduce the effects of nitrogen narcosis, a condition that can cause a narcotic-like effect when divers breathe nitrogen under pressure. Thankfully, this state is entirely reversible, but while it's happening, divers often describe the sensation as similar to being intoxicated by alcohol. However, in the 2 weeks leading up to this dive, Rob and Duffer had been diving to depths of 200 feet with the film crew, breathing only compressed air. They kept Trimex tanks nearby for safety, but neither of them experienced any symptoms of nitrogen narcosis, even at those depths. So, just like those previous dives, as they continued into the blue hole, they felt no effects from breathing air well beyond the 100-foot threshold. As they carefully navigated the restriction, the space around them would intermittently expand and then tighten back down to a mere 2 feet. But they took their time, and the journey through the restriction was routine, nothing different from what they had encountered before. After about 30 feet, a small crack in the wall opened up into a massive ocean rift. Unlike the restriction, which is a tight, narrow passage, a rift is on a whole different scale. It's vast. When they entered the rift, it felt as if they had drifted into outer space. Aside from the wall behind them, they were now suspended in a boundless void. Their flashlights cut through the darkness, but all they illuminated was more emptiness. No ceiling, no floor, no distant walls, just an endless black expanse at the edge of their beams. For Rob and Duffer, 2 seasoned cave divers, this was the thrill they had been seeking. They planned to explore for about 20 minutes before starting their long ascent. With so much of the cave unexplored, no one knew how deep it truly went. Naturally, Rob was eager to find out. Rob signaled to Duffer that they should descend further, and Duffer gave the OK signal. They began their descent once again. Upon reaching a depth of 220 feet, they switched from compressed air to trimix and continued down. Astonishingly, even after descending further, there was still no sign of a bottom. Could it really be a bottomless abyss, they thought. When they reached their planned maximum depth and still couldn't see the floor, Rob signaled that it was time to turn back. Though he wanted to find the bottom, they had to stick to their schedule and begin the ascent. So far, everything had gone smoothly, routine even. Rob started to ascend and Duffer prepared to follow. But suddenly, disaster struck. One of Duffer's trimix regulators malfunctioned. Duffer tried to fix it, but couldn't get it working, forcing him to switch back to compressed air. He wasn't sure how this would affect him, especially since neither he nor Rob had felt any symptoms of nitrogen narcosis all the way down to 220 feet. However, at this depth, this was extremely dangerous. As the diver descends, the pressure intensifies, and with it, the partial pressure of the gases they're breathing, particularly oxygen. The partial pressure of oxygen is critical because the human body can only withstand a certain level before it turns toxic. Switching back to compressed air at such a depth, where the oxygen partial pressure could be dangerously high, could trigger severe convulsions. But by this point, Duffer was already staring death in the face, so he switched to compressed air. After just a few breaths, a massive wave of narcosis slammed him hard. Fortunately, luck was on his side. It wasn't debilitating, but it was still enough to cause major concern. Determined to stay calm and focused, Duffer began to ascend, feeling better with every foot he gained. Still, the prudent thing to do was to let Rob know that he had experienced a regulator failure and was forced to switch back to compressed air. The symptoms of nitrogen narcosis could return at any moment, and Rob needed to be aware in case Duffer suddenly became incapacitated. Using hand signals, Duffer tried to convey what had happened to his trimix regulator, but instead of an acknowledging signal, Rob responded with something Duffer couldn't quite understand. It was clear that neither diver fully grasped what the other was trying to communicate, but Duffer got the sense that Rob at least understood something was wrong. As Duffer led the way toward the opening that would take them back through the restriction, he suddenly realized something was wrong. Rob was no longer behind him. Duffer quickly aimed his flashlight downward and saw Rob, who was free-falling into the abyss below. Without hesitation, Duffer began descending rapidly, noticing that Rob wasn't kicking and was plummeting fast. After chasing him down between 30 and 40 feet, Duffer managed to catch up and stop Rob's fall by grabbing onto his left ankle. He then began the exhausting task of towing Rob back up. As Duffer kicked his way upward, he recalled their last attempt at communication and began to wonder if Rob, like him, had also been forced to switch back to compressed air. But in his frantic effort to drag Rob toward the exit, Duffer had been kicking so hard that he accidentally kicked off both of his fins. Despite this string of bad luck, he kept kicking as hard as he could, determined to get Rob to safety. He managed to haul Rob all the way to the entrance of the narrow passage, which was at about 170 feet. But as he approached the passage, Duffer paused. He suddenly realized he had no idea how he was going to get Rob through the tight restriction. The passage was too narrow to swim side by side, and trying to pull Rob while swimming backward seemed impossible. Just then, something miraculous happened. Rob began to regain consciousness, and Duffer noticed that he was starting to kick his feet again. When Duffer released Rob's ankle, Rob's kicks became more coordinated, similar to when he had started falling. A wave of relief washed over Duffer. Whatever had happened, Rob seemed to be okay, and that was all that mattered. Before attempting the passage, Duffer checked his air gauge and saw that he only had 300 psi left in his tank. Not ideal, but he wasn't too worried because they had spare tanks just on the other side of the restriction. He signaled to Rob to follow him and began squeezing his way through the tight crack. Rob followed closely below as they both wedged themselves sideways between the rocks, with nothing but darkness below them. Inch by inch, they made their way through until the passage became so tight that Duffer had to lead the way with Rob in tow. Once Duffer emerged from the restriction, he immediately hooked up to one of the spare tanks they had stashed earlier. This tank contained nitrox, a gas blend higher in oxygen than compressed air, which helps divers decompress during their ascent. After taking a few breaths, Duffer turned back to the entrance, shining his light, expecting to see Rob following close behind, but Rob wasn't there. Panic set in as Duffer began frantically signaling with his flashlight toward the large cavern where one of the support divers, Tom Iliff, was stationed. When Tom finally reached him, Duffer used hand signals to explain that Rob had disappeared and that someone needed to go back through the restriction to find him. Unfortunately, Tom, who was 6'4" and 210 pounds, was much too large to safely navigate the narrow passage. He was also running low on air and lacked the experience and training required to make such a risky dive. This left Duffer with no options. His recent switch to nitrox meant that he was breathing a gas mixture with higher oxygen content than compressed air. If he went back down to search for Rob while breathing nitrox, the oxygen could become toxic at deeper depths, putting his life at risk. Even if that wasn't a concern, trying to navigate the restriction while carrying 3 tanks and attempting to rescue Rob would nearly guarantee death. Duffer and Tom had no choice but to leave Rob behind and begin their ascent to the surface. But due to the depth and duration of their dive, they had to endure 3 agonizing hours of decompression stops on the way up. During that time, Duffer was left alone with only his thoughts, tormented by the knowledge that he had been forced to abandon his friend. At around 2 a.m. the next morning, Duffer and Tom surfaced and climbed back on the boat. He then gathered everyone up to let them know that Rob was gone. For a moment, the crew was frozen in stunned silence until one of the support divers suddenly erupted in anger, yelling that they should have told her. She could have been in and out of the crack in 15 minutes. This outraged diver was Steffi Schwab, the widow of the recently deceased Rob Palmer. However, an immediate rescue operation wasn't possible. It would be 2 days until the tides would allow them to return to the restriction to recover Rob's body. They would eventually find him at 149 feet, wedged in a space less than 2 feet wide. US Coast Guard investigators concluded that Rob's death was a drowning caused by nitrogen narcosis, but how Rob became narked in the first place is a complete mystery. Rob's body was later prepared and flown back to England, where he was cremated. His ashes were then spread around his favorite caves nearby. If you made it this far, consider subscribing for more videos detailing the final moments of the most horrific tragedies in human history. Thanks for watching.